Briefly, my aim for this project is to create the ultimate Game & Watch handheld. I want it to be in the vein of something like the SNES Mini, but instead a device that can play dozens of Game & Watch LCD games that were released in the 1980s. This video is part 2 of 2 however. I highly recommend first watching part 1, where I cover emulation and hardware like the screen, sound, battery, and the beginnings of the control system. It's linked on screen now, in the description, and probably as a pinned comment. At the end of part 1, we had all the hardware and emulation operational, except for the controller. We'll delve into how I managed that today, as well as designing, printing, building, and painting the case. So, let's go! As you can imagine, I wish the case design to resemble the essence of Game & Watches, but with so many different designs out there, I had a splash of creative liberty to throw around. In the end, I went with a 3-tier design, with the front plate taking inspiration from both my knockoff handheld and the newer Game & Watches Nintendo have released in recent years. It ended up being quite the chonk, and the reason for that is a mix of the compulsory kickstand and my novice design skills. But with that in mind, let's begin with the bottom piece. I'm not sure why I went with a 3-piece design after I swore I wouldn't again after the Vectrex Mini, but here we are. This piece would include the kickstand, but also hold the battery. The slot on the left is big enough that the battery sits snugly, and the gap on the right essentially enables a void so the battery's cable can plug into the charger. On the back, we can see the cutout for the kickstand. This is held in place at the top by an additional piece that slots in. Fast forwarding in time, and here it is in action. Works as intended, but the bulk it adds doesn't really make it worthwhile. But hey, can't have a Game & Watch without a kickstand, that's what I always say. The last thing to note about this back piece is the 4 through holes for 10mm M4 screws that hold the middle and top pieces together. To attach this piece to the middle, however, there are 4 5mm M3 screw holes. This makes things overly complicated, and it's a pain to access the battery once the handheld is assembled, but it is what it is. I prototyped the core components of this piece, namely the slots for the battery and kickstand, before printing the finished product. That alone took over 8 hours, so it was desirable everything fit first go. Moving on to the middle piece, a lot more prototyping was also required. This portion would hold the Pi, the screen, and everything required for power and audio. Prototyping these individual mounts took the majority of the time, but again, these needed to be correct for the final hours-long print. I wish I had filmed this process more. I don't even have the prototype bits and pieces anymore. They sat on my desk for months before finally going in the bin, but I'm sure you get the idea. Complete, you can see the opening for the battery cable and switch, required holes for screws, a ledge for the screen to sit on so it doesn't sag. It is quite top heavy compared to the tiny Pi Zero after all, and lastly, a bunch of mounts. The Pi and voltage charger converter already include mounting holes, but since I built the low pass filter myself, it would require more DIY. In the theme of Vero boards and doing things the old fashioned way, I simply drilled them. I'm not sure how else I would have done it, honestly. Thankfully, in a rare instance of foresight, I allowed enough room around the components and solder points for holes that didn't disrupt anything. Regardless, this middle piece took over 9 hours to print. Thankfully, the legwork in the prototyping stage paid off again, and the print was a success. Lastly, there's the top third of the case design, which took a total of 6 hours to print. A degree of prototyping was required yet again, but not as much as the previous portions. There's the slot and cutout for the screen, a grill and speaker holder, button stuff, and a section for the Arduino Pro Micro to slot into. Being the genius I am, however, I placed that slot poorly. Thus, the Pro Micro doesn't actually fit there. I figured out a solution later, but this is one of the project's main blunders. Not so bad, I guess, compared to the endless shenanigans of the Vectrex Mini anyway. Back to the buttons, I employed a similar system to the controller I built for the Vectrex. I stole a lot of design cues from the knockoff NES controller this time around, however. Essential, really, since I would be reusing the rubber pads and buttons. The main difference was that instead of a circuit board, the buttons and rubber pads would action against physical switches. I designed assemblies to hold all 3 components in place, which do work, but again, add quite a lot of height. The buttons are satisfying to use though, that I'm certain. Clicky is always better. While this process worked well for the A, B, start and select buttons, the D-pad ran into problems. I tried my best to design and tweak the switch holder, but no matter what I tried, multiple switches would push down at the same time. Obviously that's not ideal, and this was an issue that stumped me for a while. I could have designed my own D-pad button to be more compatible with the switches of course, but for some reason I was compelled to reuse that D-pad. So I focused my attention back to the knockoff NES controller where it originated. As I mentioned, the clicky buttons are my doing. In the original NES controller, the rubber pads connect directly to pads on the circuit board, the proper way of doing things if you will. Since I was having no luck with the switches, I decided to steal that section of the circuit board for the D-pad and simply rewire it. It was destined for the bin after all. I did it for the whales. To begin, I figured out exactly which lines of signal or ground by beeping them out. This would determine where I could snap the circuit board to size. Using the same technique as the low pass filter I built in part 1, I first scorched the snap point with a knife and metal ruler. Like before, snapping the board into exactly where I wanted it to was clean and very satisfying. I then scraped away the traces so I could solder wires directly. There wasn't much room to work or much room for error on that note, but after a few attempts, I successfully primed the points and attached wires that were solidly secured. And how about that? It works. Let's wire the buttons into the case. There's no footage of me doing the deed since that would be dull to watch, but everything went well. At least until I broke the USB port off the Pro Micro. I guess I plugged and unplugged the cable too many times, and the little tucker just couldn't handle it. This probably wouldn't have been the biggest issue, except I was yet to finalize all the buttons on the software side of things. So another delay for this project while I wait for a replacement to be delivered. Fast forward a week or whatever, and a brand new Pro Micro is fully programmed and installed. It was at this point, however, I realized I didn't account for the extra service buttons in the case design. So it was time to pull the drill out again and produce some holes. Except, evidently, I can't drill straight. And to add insult to injury, it turns out I only needed one button. If I had stopped at the first perfectly centered hole, everything would be cherry. But now, all the glamour shots for this handheld need to be from the other side. Regardless of that, here are all buttons wired up and working. I did run into a minor issue mapping the buttons through RetroPie however. Since I'm only using a handful of inputs, you'll need another paired controller or keyboard to skip past the options you don't need. Since the Zero only includes one port for input, and since I surprisingly don't own a USB hub, I instead use my PS4 controller via Bluetooth. Too easy. And bam! Here are all the electronics totally operational and independent of anything else. What a milestone. There were two last pieces of housekeeping however. I would still need a USB cable connecting the Pro Micro to the Pi. It didn't make sense to hardwire it because A, it would permanently connect the two top halves of the case, and B, because that would be really hard. A traditional USB cable would be too bulky, so instead I built a micro USB to micro USB cable using FlexWire. It could be as short as I needed it to be while also being flexible. Custom problems require custom solutions. Lastly, there was a bit more 3D printing required. I refer to these as accent pieces, not necessary for functionality, but for sporting good looks, if you get my drift. Firstly, there's the iconic screen bump a lot of original Game & Watches included. I would print this in two pieces, since the inside trim is red. The other accent pieces are for the buttons. Again, a hallmark of the originals I'm basing the design on, I thought it would look quite nice if each button had raised red outlines. None of these pieces took a particularly long time to print, so with that stage complete, let's delve into painting. I decided on a two-tone color design, red and black. Everything was already printed in black, so I would only need to paint the bottom and middle cases red, as well as the accent pieces. There would be three stages to the painting: primer, the color red, and lastly, a clear coat for protection. I would be using spray cans to achieve this. Peeps like to poop all over using spray cans, but as long as you're consistent with the spray passes, I find the result to be super even and consistent. I started with a Tamiya branded primer, which is already featured in a few different projects. Unfortunately, its time was up after spraying the bottom piece of the case. Almost perfectly so. I failed to get any more out of it for the middle piece. So, it was time for a Bunnings montage. Not the first for this channel either. I came home with a different brand, Deluxe. Bunnings doesn't stock Tamiya. I found my original can in a hobby shop. Surprisingly, at least to me who doesn't have a deep knowledge of primer, the deluxe was clear. I didn't like this because I couldn't tell how much I had applied. I also had the daft idea to spray the smaller accent pieces in a plastic container. I was worried they would get blown away by the spray or otherwise get lost. And again, they received the deluxe clear treatment. The next day, it was time for the first coat of red. This applied fine to the bottom piece with the Tamiya primer, but anything that used the deluxe primer dripped and adhered poorly. Checking the dried pieces the next day, the Tamiya piece looked well on its way, but the middle piece was hot garbage. The coat was uneven, and you could see where it dripped. The paint also adhered the small pieces to the plastic container. Pulling them out warped them and also ripped off the paint. Fantastic. So, long story short, which I didn't film, the Tamiya bottom piece received one more coat of red, followed by the clear coat, and it was done. The middle piece was sanded and repainted with a new can of Tamiya primer, along with the 2 coats of red and then the clear coat. I scrapped all the smaller pieces since it was trivial to reprint them. They then received the same painting treatment as the cases, this time without the plastic container. After all that, which was over the course of a week since each coat needed to dry overnight, I was quite happy with the end results. But it took way too long. Next time, I'm simply going to buy different coloured filaments and everything will be the desired colour from the get-go. Now to glue the accent pieces to the top of the case. I'm giving this glue a go, which Sellies refers to as the control bottle. Supposedly, it's good for high precision applications. Handy since the accent pieces are so small. I started with the screen bump trim, and it went well enough. I then slowly worked each button insert, being careful not to over apply the glue. Lastly, the entire screen bump went on without any hassle. Easy. At least until you get super glue on your forehead. Let's watch that again in slow-mo. Looking good. Not bad for a guy who just headbutted an open glue bottle. With everything glued and painted, I decided to hot snot the service button into place. This is designed to access emulation menus while a ROM is running. It's also part of a button combo to exit games. With that, it was time for the final assembly. I'm so happy to see this finished. Finally. Although I should add that the round button inserts were too small and popped off when I slotted the buttons through. Since the buttons are red anyway, I decided to leave them off and clean the residual paint with IPA. Okay, we made it. How does it play though? Well, not bad if I say so myself. It's comfortable to hold and the buttons are responsive enough. Well, except for the start and select buttons. The inserts are a bit high, making them difficult to press. Not a huge issue since they're not really used for gaming purposes, but it's probably for the best I kept the inserts off the A and B buttons. If I were to do it again, it would be a good excuse to design and print higher buttons. Maybe I could even go for a full circuit design like for the D-pad. I've always wanted to learn a program like Eagle and print my own designs. There would be no more of this old school Vero business, and it would contribute to a slimmer handheld. Plus, it's always fun to learn new skills. On that note, this has inspired me to try and build more handhelds. This one is good for the NES era of gaming, but what if the next revision was designed around the SNES and Mega Drive generation? And after that, another for the PlayStation and N64 period of gaming? Much to think about. We'll see how we go. It would be wise to at least wait for the global part shortage to end so the prices go down. But back to this handheld. The main aspect I would like to improve on is the thickness. It's a chunky boy at over 40mm tall. I think I can do better. The exclusion of the kickstand would definitely help. Lastly, I really need to do away with the 3-piece case design. I should have learned how bad an idea it was after the Vectrex Mini, but I'll give it up next time, I promise. So, we started with the goal of a device that was perfect for emulating Game & Watches, but what we really ended up with was a 3rd generation all-rounder. So, the whole premise of this being the ultimate Game & Watch is a little clickbaity. I'm sorry about that. Either way, this has been a fun, if not elongated experience. Thank you so much for sharing it with me, and I'll catch you in the next video.